Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist behind the webcomic False Knees. It's Joshua Barkman. Thanks for coming on, Joshua.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
So, for listeners that don't know, False Knees is a webcomic that Joshua creates that, at least in the case of its book release, was described as an illustrated guide to animal behavior. And I say that as a descriptor because in some ways, as I was telling you before, it is, I don't know, it's interesting. It's kind of indescribable. It's sort of about everything. It's like about life, but it's also about birds and squirrels and other animals. And as I told you before, I'm going to do something that I never ask creators to do. I'm going to ask you to describe your own comic. So when somebody is like, what is False Knees? What is it about? What's your stock answer?
I think what I usually tell people is it is hard for me to describe too. I feel like oddly too close to it to have a good, way of describing it.
I do think it's interesting when you're kind of immersed in something. It's like, it's False Knees. It is what it is. It's like, you can't even describe it because it's just everything.
I mean, to me, it's very much like a huge part of my life. So to try to boil it down to a description, well, I'm going to try right now. I think it's a webcomic. It's usually comedic. I really, at some point a couple of years ago, made a big switch and just started to use animals exclusively. And yeah, it is a bit about, it's not about animals necessarily, although it can be sometimes. I do try to make like the odd comic about something specific about an animal's life, but it is really about people. It's about people's lives. It's about relationships that people have with each other, like loneliness. It's about, all the things that I feel on a daily basis, just put through a bird's perspective.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever read cartoonist Carl Kerschel's The Abominable Charles Christopher?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, I love that comic. And in some ways, False Knees reminds me of that in the sense that, in that comic, there's like half of it is like an ongoing story involving Charles Christopher, this abominable snowman, and all these other things that he's going through on his journey. And then the other half is kind of like, I described it to him when he was on the podcast recently, as like Seinfeld, where it's kind of about everything, but it's also really just about these animals. It's just like life told through the prism of a bunch of animals. And I think to a certain degree, that's kind of what False Knees is too. It's just, I don't know. I think that's part of the reason why so many people love it is it's funny. And there's like some ones where it's just like kind of a bit, but then there's other times where it's just like, I see myself in this. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. There was a time a few years ago where like relatability was the go-to for webcomics. And I definitely went into that too. I mean, there's a good reason why it makes popular webcomics. And yeah, I've definitely used that a lot in False Knees. I think I discovered Carl Kerschel's comic after I started putting animals into my comic. But yeah, I definitely see the resemblance. He does a lot of kind of, like you say, Seinfeld, like vignettes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it could just be a gag using a certain animal, but he has recurring characters.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like even the side characters they come back, like the raccoons and the
skunks.
The skunks with their
salesmen. Yeah, the scams. I love it. Well, okay, so before we get too far into False Knees, I do want to talk about like your origins, because I like when people first come on the podcast, I like to talk to them about kind of, what came first, the comics or the art. But for you, I think it's interesting. It's like, it really feels as I read the comic. I'm going to be totally honest. I asked my friend who's a natural sciences artist. I was like, what do you think about this guy's stuff? Like, what do you think about his birds and everything? Because she really, like, her focus is on birds. Like, she does birds all the time. And she was like, His birds are excellent. They're certainly more stylized, but accurate and lovely indeed. And she said that she loves your corvids. Like, but the thing about it is like you didn't start with the birds and everything like that. You really kind of dug into it, and it feels like the the birds you do are real labors of love. So that's the wrinkle I'm gonna add in there. What came first, your love of comics, art, or nature?
Well, I think it definitely came in different stages. Like I grew up in the countryside,
Mm-hmm.
and so I've always had a respect for animals and nature, but I didn't really know anything about them. Like I grew up on a farm. I really didn't see that many wild animals, and we had a lot of cats, so they scared off all the birds for like my entire childhood. I only really started noticing them in my adult years. Um, I I don't know. I think yeah. I started off with a little bit of a love for nature, and then growing up, of course, I read like newspaper comics, and then in university, I started reading a lot of web comics, and I saw an opportunity to kind of bridge all of these things. I mean, it took a few years of me,
Figured yourself out.
yeah, to figure out the comic. When I first started False Knees, I mean, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I I was really trying to emulate other webcomics of the time that I thought were funny. So it's a lot of just like ridiculous, situational, semi autobiographical comics of yeah me, like a pseudo me in various absurd situations. I was really trying to style it off after. Do you know Moonbeard?
I don't.
No, okay. Or like what were some other, or like Hark of Vagrant?
Oh yeah, Hark of Vagrant for sure. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I really wanted to make a funny comic, but I think after a while of doing it, I started getting a little frustrated with my artwork, and I just kept wanting to make that better and better and better. And it got to the point where that was sort of the driving force of the comic, is to make a nicer looking comic.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I fell onto birds, it just kind of it meshed everything nicely, and I've stuck with it ever since, because honestly, it feels like the meeting point of all the things that I love, and I think that there's real opportunity to make comics in a different way, or at least I thought it was a little different, to make them nice looking predominantly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that is one thing. I went back and I read, I don't want to say I read every one of your comics, but I started at the beginning and I got pretty far. And then I also started at the end and went backwards. And so, I mean, it's, I'm not defaming, 2013, 2011 Joshua Barkman, but your improvement in art is honestly astonishing. It is like staggering watching it. And so I can definitely, it feels like when I was looking through all those that you're constantly trying to kind of push yourself in ways to challenge yourself, but also to be like, can I get better at this? Was that kind of something you were doing throughout?
Yeah, I think it's what I keep doing actually. That's really what is pushing me to make comics still, is to, like, I'm never satisfied with the way that my comic looks. The last comic that I've made is always the one that I'm kind of least happy with visually.
Sure.
So I keep trying to push it to the point where it meets the image of a comic that I have in my mind that I don't really, it's hard to describe it. I think I have an ideal of what I want my comic to look like.
Right.
And I'm trying to get there. And I think slowly, with the more time that I put into the artwork, I am getting closer to it. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny. I actually read another interview with you where you said, I have a vague image of what my comics could look like in my head. Something like Calvin and Hobbes mixed with surreal French comics. And I actually think that you're getting there. It's one of the things I like about your strip is like there's sometimes where there'll be ones where I don't know, like I'm trying to remember which one it was. There was one that was about a pair of birds about like talking about perspective and about how like maybe the world looks differently to one another. And then all of a sudden you bring in a completely different art style in the fourth one to show that the one bird is seeing the world completely different.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, like, I like that thing. That's one of the things that I really appreciate about strip comics is, and this, you know, we're going to get into formats here in a little bit, but I think
Sure.
one of the things that's interesting is, especially if you can look at it strip by strip, like you do on Instagram,
Yeah.
there's like a reveal element to it where the art shifting is like a really hard hammer on like the last panel. And like that's one of the cool things you can do is you can both play with your art, but also play with a way that the reader engages with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, for all the things that is wrong about Instagram, and there's so many,
Right.
that feature of the app makes it really interesting as a comic writer. Um, the carousel feature, it's called,
Hmm.
where you swipe one image at a time. And it's really, I think it's actually had a big impact on the way that I make comics because that's where most of my audience is. And I have tailored a lot of comics to meet that function. And I think it's phenomenal. It really reminds me of flipping through a book.
Hmm.
And in comic books, it's a really common thing to hide a really beautiful picture, or not necessarily beautiful, but shocking or striking,
Impactful.
yeah, impactful picture on the other side of a page, right? Like you can tell that there's this buildup happening, and then you flip the page, and it's like, oh my god. Um, and Instagram kind of has that to a lesser degree, and I do want to exploit that more and more. I think that there's lots of opportunity with the way that it's formatted right now to make, yeah, like an interesting reveal, which I think is exciting. Other websites don't or apps don't really necessarily have that. You have just on like internet on the like a browser on the desktop, you could have something revealed as you scroll down, but that's a little bit trickier to do
Right.
uh, for like a panel comic thing.
The cadence is way different on that. I mean, that is one of the things that I think is really fascinating is looking at your comic. I look through. I don't think I look through everything, but I look through the way that False Knees reads on, you know, just varying different platforms, and it's really fascinating to see like the all the different considerations you'd probably have to make. I mean, for one, Twitter alone is just a nightmare because you don't even know where like the preview I don't even know what they call it, like the what the slice they're going to select when they preview it on the desktop version, because like
Yeah,
sometimes it'll cut off part of it and you can only see part of it when you have the four images up,
yeah,
and if you put up all four simultaneously as just one image, it's gonna, god only knows what it's gonna select. And I don't know, I think that's one of the interesting things is, you know, you might look at somebody might talk to you about the way that the formats work and everything like that, but those are, you know, for you those are storytelling considerations as much as anything, right?
yeah. And the Twitter, I think Twitter has improved it over the past couple months. It was really, really bad, especially at the beginning of this year, where they would, yeah, I think they were using, I don't know, some kind of AI to determine what the main focus of attention should be on any given image. And often it would focus on the words. So yeah, you're right. If I post, you can post four images at a time on a tweet. And if I were to do that, it would show the punchline, basically. If it's a text punchline, you'd be able to see it right from the beginning, which is really frustrating.
Right.
Like it's so much work to make comics, and for it to just be spoiled
Hmm.
immediately, and you have no say as to what the viewer will see, that's so frustrating as a storyteller. Um, I think it's probably gotten a little bit better, and there are ways of manipulating images so that you have, I don't know, more control over what the preview shows. But it is definitely frustrating, and it's something that you have to think of for every single platform.
Yeah. We'll get to that here in a little bit. I do want to back up a bit because one thing I think is really interesting about the origins of False Knees is, okay, from what I understand, you started making comics because an opportunity presented itself at your university newspaper, where somebody was just like, "Oh, this is a thing."
Yeah.
Had you made comics before then?
No, no. I think I went through some old sketchbooks, and I had made some really bad, tasteless, just like one comic when I was traveling when I was 18. And apart from that, I had never made one before. I'd sort of dabbled in kind of like a New Yorker style, like silly drawing with a quip underneath.
Sure.
But yeah, the first time I made comics was the first one that you can see on my website, for better or for worse. And yeah, a friend of mine told me he was working at the newspaper at the time at Concordia University, and he told me that they were looking for things to fill the pages with. So I applied and I got in. So
that is amazing. I mean, honestly, like I would not have the guts to do that. I always wanted to be an artist, but I like sharing it, like even with my family, was just a no-go. And so you just went straight into it. But I do think that's interesting though, because there's this one cartoonist that I just did an interview with. Her name is Brenna Thumler, and she did a graphic novel recently called Delicates. And the one before the one that was before that in the series was basically like the second comic she'd ever drawn, and she wrote and illustrated the entire thing, and it's amazing, like just remarkable work, just astonishing art. But the thing I really love about it is the fact that she came to comics without having the love of comics that a lot of people have, and came to comics without like all of the things that you do when you make comics like beat into her head. And so she makes comics her completely own way. And I think that I don't know. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Like, I wonder if there's a certain amount of freedom to the way that you approach making strips, because you don't have like, I mean, you read comics, but you didn't have like maybe expectations of schooling or other things put into your brain before you started making them. You just did it.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I think, yeah, I don't think I had expectations that anybody would read it. So that's probably what helped me make them in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely had my own idea of what comics could be, I think. And I've definitely tried to experiment with different ideas. A few years ago, I was really pushing for just making silent, basically, they were just paintings, like 4 paintings in a row of just plants or just trees. And I thought, well, that could be a comic too. It's not funny. It's not really telling a story, but it's just what I felt like doing. And I think a lot of that experimentation has led to what I'm doing now.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Do you have a sense as to when False Knees kind of started going from like a thing you were doing for fun to like this very real thing?
Yeah, I do. I could even pinpoint it to the comic. Um, I It was in 2016, I think. I had just quit my job a few months earlier with the idea that I would try to do comics full time, and I still wasn't even making any money from it. So it was a crazy decision, but I did it for a few months, and it was looking okay. Like I wasn't uh, making any money off of it still. But then I had this comic sort of go viral, and it was essentially just a rabbit swearing
Mm-hmm.
about like just commenting on what a nice day it was. Yeah, it's so simple, so such a simple idea. But that's the one after I made it, people started ordering prints of it, and it was right around the same time that I went to TCAF, the Toronto Comic Arts Fair,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I got a lot of attention there for that comic, I think. And
Were people like, you're the rabbit swearing guy?
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was the first time that in person I would actually feel like people were reading my comic. Uh, People would say like, "Oh, I've seen this before." Like it was back in the Tumblr days, still, and yeah, people had seen it on Tumblr, and I think that's the moment that it went from being something that I just like to do to actually starting to be my job.
Did you know that there's an entire Know Your Meme page that effectively breaks down like the leaps in popularity your comic has?
Like it chronologically.
Kinda, yeah. There's like there was I don't remember if it was, I think it was the rabbit one where they're like, False Knees first leap took place this point when this comic had 467,000 reblogs on Tumblr, and I was just like,
Like,
oh, interesting. And then it was like the next one. I thought my guess was it was going to be the owl when the owl tried telling a knock knock joke to the fake owl. Because it seemed like on Instagram that was one where it was like the likes went from like pretty good to like really good,
yeah,
and
yeah.
but I imagine that's something you kind of see where there's one strip goes viral and then all of a sudden it kind of it's the rising tide that lifts all ships.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It all becomes easier after that.
Yeah.
Huh. What a great resource, historical resource. Know your meme.
Eventually all we're going to have to know what happened was Wikipedia and Know Your Meme. We're going to have the two most important websites on the internet.
That's great.
Before we go to like today, why that's one question I forgot to ask earlier on. Why did you choose False Knees as the title?
This is even worse than trying to describe my own comic. I don't have a good answer for it. It's just
It just felt right.
it just felt right. I was trying to make a name that sounded nice on the tongue.
Sure.
So I had a list. I don't know if I kept that piece of paper that I had a list of comic names on. Um, yeah, I don't know. I was just trying to make something that sounded good.
And now, a message from Bad Idea. Bad Idea is over. But there's still advertising, so I don't know what's going on. I guess it's another bad idea from Bad Idea. And now, back to the show. I feel like this is very fitting reference given who I'm talking to, but there's do you know the musician Andrew Bird?
Yeah.
Andrew Bird made an album where, from what I understand, and apologies to Andrew Bird if you happen to be listening to this and I'm completely wrong about this, but he made an album where instead of choosing lyrics for meaning, he chose it for sound.
No
And
way.
yeah, and it was interesting because you listen to it and it's like the lyrics sound amazing and they like flow together and you're like, I don't know if this song totally makes sense. And it's interesting because I feel like False Knees, like I can see it from that perspective where it's just you won't it evokes the right feel when you say it as much as anything. Andrew Bird would approve of the name, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Bird approved.
I think that even works for some of my comics. Sometimes it's just, yeah, I pick the words just based on the sounds. Is that Mysterious Production of Eggs?
What's that? No, it was God, I forgot what the name of the album was. It was one that was like in 2011 or something like that. It was later. But yeah, no, Mysterious Production of Eggs was well before then. But
Okay.
so shift to today. I'm curious as to like what do you start your comics with? Does it start with like a joke, a bird, an idea you happen to think of, or does it really just depend on the day and the comic?
I'd say it depends. A lot of the time these days, I start with, well, one of my hobbies is to walk around and take pictures. I've gotten more and more into that over the past couple of years. And I've even gotten a little bit better at taking wildlife pictures. I like to take as many of my own reference pictures as I can. I feel like I'm sort of stealing or doing something wrong if I'm basing the drawings of my birds off of photos that I find online.
Mm-hmm.
So I try take my own pictures for my comics, and that's often where it can start. Like, I'm just outside and I get inspiration from a leaf or from a flower or from the way that a light is shining onto a scene, or yeah, a bird that I've never seen before. And so often I can just sit down. I'll draw out my little frames, my square frames, and then I'll start painting what I want to paint. And then depending on how it comes out, how, the look of a bird, I can kind of make up a situation for it. I can't say that that's the best way of making comics because it can be grueling to uh, make up my mind about the direction to take something. If I have an idea before I have the visuals for something, it's a lot easier to get to the end stage because the joke is already written and I just have to come up with the, different composition, different angles that the camera is looking at, which is fun. That's a lot easier. I've spent so many, grueling hours and days sometimes just staring at these half-finished comics, trying to come up with a situation. It's not a good way. You comic makers out there, don't do it that way. It's bad.
I do think it's funny though, because I came across the dinosaur comic strip that you did for Ryan North on when I was going through all the comics. In some ways, you're kind like when you do it like that, it is kind of like dinosaur comics where it's like, the structure, you just have to come up with like the concept and what the punchline is and all the stuff like that.
Yeah.
It probably is tougher because it seems like pacing is a really important thing for you. Like, one really good example is there's the one, I think this was one of your very viral ones where it was two birds sitting on branches and the one bird is like, didn't this leaf used to be green? And it's like, yeah. It's like, well, I forgot what he says exactly, but he just, the bird that asked that question just keeps asking what, because he's continuously surprised. But the thing I always love about it is the fact that you leave the third panel textless and then use it in the fourth one, because that's comic timing. That's giving it a beat to breathe. That's another one that reads way differently across platforms, by the way.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah, the beat is such an important element to comic making. It can be kind of a crutch at times. But the whole framing of comics, the whole calculating of beats, and it's really built into the way that I think of making comics now. I'm sure Ryan North, oh my God, with dinosaur comics, he has those 6 frames baked into his psyche, I'm sure.
Oh, I hope so at this point.
Oh yeah, how many has he made? Like 3,000 or something?
I don't know. Like I would be surprised if it wasn't a lot more than that, to be honest. It just feels like he's been doing it for forever.
Yeah, yeah. And in the same way, if you keep doing a 4-frame comic for years and years and years, you start thinking about all jokes that way. You start thinking little tiny stories that you can tell in that amount of time, and it's really helpful when you're not at your drawing desk. You can kind of count it in your head and work it out. But as I say, you can start to rely on those crutches at times, which I fear can kind of make comics a little predictable.
Sure.
So yeah, that third frame beat, it's still so effective, and I love using it because you can really pay a lot of attention to the artwork of something. But I think it is important to keep trying different things.
Yeah.
So it doesn't become an every comic kind of device.
Well, and I think part of it, for you, you're looking to constantly improve with your art. I think art is inseparable from storytelling. And if you just rely on the same structures, you're not improving yourself. You're just kind of doing that. But then beyond that, I know that the way that people read web comics is kind of all over the place. Sometimes they only read them when they're viral. Sometimes they read them every single time it comes up. Sometimes they binge read them. And especially for the latter audience, it's like if you read a ton of false knees and you're just doing the same thing over and over, you'll start to feel that samey nature, if that makes sense. Like, you'll feel like you're just kind of hitting the same beats, and maybe that has less of an impact at that point. And so I think that there's value to trying to think outside that box, and literally outside the box, and when it comes to the storytelling, because it's like it ensures you don't get bored, but also ensures readers don't get bored.
Yeah. I try to read a lot of book format comics to keep my mind open to different framing. I'm trying to design my comics a little bit differently as time goes on. I'm more and more interested in a little bit longer comics, or comics that don't have just square frames all the time.
Right.
Yeah, because the reader will get bored, and I'll get bored. So
I really love the strip you did where it was like the birds talking. I forgot what the one bird says, but I think he's like saying about how he's like he would prefer to be alone or something like that. And then the other bird is like, could you do that? And it's like birds flying together, making a beautiful shape. And
right.
And he says something like, I could do that better alone, or something along those lines. And the thing I really love about that strip, though, is like that's another one where you break the cadence. You do like I think it starts with a square panel, and then it's like a much larger panel. That's another thing, though. Like, how do you render that across like 9 different formats? I imagine something like that was a challenge.
That one I really made thinking of Instagram, because even if you have a long, like horizontally rectangular frame, you can still kind of do it so that it looks like it's stitched together. So you still get the impression that it's a much larger frame, even though it's essentially still 2 square frames. But yeah, across platforms does not work as well. Facebook is the worst, always. Then there's Twitter is pretty difficult to make that work.
I imagine with Twitter you would have to, so like there's the one that you did where it has like the full wingspan of the bird, which works great on Instagram, but I mean,
yeah.
do you turn that like into a single image?
I think I did.
Yeah. Well, and the 4 image limit is a real pain in the ass whenever you want to go more than 6 or more than 4, right?
It is a huge pain in the ass. When I see other comic artists do it, my heart goes out to them, because the number of people that read the second tweet must just drop off.
Yeah.
But yeah, Twitter's a hard place to make a long form comic.
Yeah. I'm curious, we're talking about pacing and everything, and one thing that I think that is a very underrated part about the humor of the book, or really just like the idea of the book, is your lettering that you do. Because a good example is a 6-panel strip that you did where it's like a bird and he's like staring at a leaf, and then the sun comes out, and then the leaf gets illuminated and everything like that. And the final panel is just hell yeah. It's just him saying hell yeah. But the hell yeah is like, people who are listening can't see this, but I'm making a very small hell yeah, and it's super tiny, and like that decision speaks volumes, because it's just like it's like that secret to yourself. It's like hell yeah.
Yeah.
And I love that about it, because like that's it's not like something that's not as obvious of a choice as like the way that you draw like a seagull or something like that. But it does change the way that you read it. Is lettering a big part of like how you want to change the reader experience?
Yeah, I think there's a huge art form to lettering, and I agree that it is really underrated. I think that it's more widely known probably in longer form, like book format comics.
Sure.
I think within webcomics, it is definitely underutilized. The fact that you can tell a little story or add jokes depending on what you do with the lettering. That being said, like, I don't know if I'm always taking advantage of it when I can. Lettering is often like a bit of an afterthought for a lot of my comics. Like I'll change the wording so many times throughout the writing of a comic that often it will end up being um, a lot more writing or a lot less writing than what I've given myself space for.
Hmm.
So I'll have to edit that digitally, and it takes a lot away from the original like point that I wanted to have in the strip. So yeah, it's important to keep in mind the lettering for strips. It's yeah, I don't know. I think it's something that I'm still learning a lot myself, but I agree when it's used well, it can be so funny or effective anyway.
Oh yeah, no, and I think you do a really good job with it. I mean, it's really like the thing that I really appreciate about False Knees is it always seems like every aspect is working together in a really effective way. It is like, I mean, I was gonna bring up there's a concept in like comics where there's multiple people working on a team where it's the idea is the faux cartoonist. It's like where you're four people are combining like Voltron into what seems like a single cartoonist, but like I think that, you know, obviously you are a cartoonist, but each of the different facets of the work really seem to flow together, even though like sometimes it's you putting yourself in a position where you've already drawn it and you're like, shit, what am I gonna do? What have I done to myself?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is putting on a lot of hats sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wish that I could just hire a writer for me. I mean, I guess I probably could. A lot of people do that.
Do you
But
prefer the art? I mean, is it? You said that art is like the thing you're looking to improve on. Is art less of a challenge for you, despite the fact that most people would probably say it's like perhaps the most difficult part of what you do?
yeah, yeah, I think I don't know. Sometimes, some days the writing comes easily, you know, and some days the art comes easily, and sometimes it's a struggle. I do think generally I have a little bit more experience with drawing and painting than I do of telling jokes. So I'm not really sure. It really depends on the day, but
Yeah,
I do think that yeah, I don't know.
I imagine it really comes down to it's like if you have a set idea, like a really good vision of what you want to do for like a gag or whatever, that's going to make the writing easier because you go in knowing that. But if you're just like, I'm going to do one that features two Blue Jays and I'm going to draw them, and then you're like, what are they going to say? I'm like, that, I mean, that's, I imagine where the writer's block is just like all up in your face.
It's a perfect way of just torturing yourself for no.
Writer Josh is suffering for the actions of artist Josh.
Yeah. Oh my God. I should write that on a piece of paper and put it on my wall.
You don't need to torture yourself more. I I am interested in though because like you mentioned earlier, like we talked about relatable strips, and I do think it's interesting how there was the trend of relatable web comics a couple years ago, and it does feel like there's certain ones, like bizarrely the one comic that really was relatable to me was your 24-hour comic that was about doing yoga.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
because that's just pretty much exactly what I imagine myself looking like when everyone's doing like down dog and like, you know, Warrior 3, and I'm just like a lump of clay on the ground. That's just what I imagine. But it is like there's the one strip where it's, I'm pretty sure it's like a raven or a crow, and they look in the water and they're like the source of all of my problems. And
Right.
people love that. Actually, one of my favorite quirks about all the stuff that you do is on Instagram, how you know how Instagram always favors like one comment above all and pushes it to the top. I think it's based off of likes or something. Almost every single time the one comment that shows says the same thing. And I'm guessing you
Right.
know what it is. Is this available as a print?
Oh. I think that goes at the top because I'll tell Instagram to put it there to encourage people to buy prints.
Oh, really? Do you? Okay. I
Well,
thought I thought that was an organic thing, but it's interesting though, because like, I swear to God, like that one, I looked through the comments and it was like a lot of people asking that question just because I don't know. I feel like so many people were like, this is me in a comic. Like I'm the source of my own problems. I need this in my life as a reminder. And I do you, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting is you're operating on all these platforms that are fundamentally built off of engagement. You have likes, you have comments, you have shares, you have reblogs, you have infinite other things. Do you try really hard to not lean into what people are connecting with, or is that something you feel like you need to like pay attention to? I mean, is there a balance there?
Yeah, I've started sort of keeping a tally of what kinds of comics that I make. I break it down into comics that I make that I think will be popular. There are comics that I make for the sake of false knees as its sort of own universe, if that makes any sense. And then I'll make comics for myself. And the comics for myself are often um, the most absurd ones, the
Yeah.
ones that don't actually make any sense. And I do that on purpose. Uh, Another cartoonist that I really love from years ago, Dakota McFadzean. He, for years, he made this daily strip. And anyway, I really looked up to him when I was first starting my comics. And I remember him saying, giving this piece of advice to people that making sense is sort of overrated.
Yeah.
And and I love that. I think that there isn't enough nonsense in the world just for the nonsense sake. But the problem with that is that it's pretty alienating for the reader. People will always try to find meaning in whatever you do,
Mm-hmm.
and people will often have a pretty good, pretty good idea of what I'm trying to say, and they'll be pretty adamant though that yeah, no, this is what he means. This is what this comic is about.
So
But
people
often
try to
it's
figure it out.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Especially the ones that I make that are pretty silly and they're purposefully really not supposed to go anywhere. People will find meaning in them. And I guess, I don't know, maybe there's something to that. Maybe subconsciously, we're always trying to impart a little bit of meaning in everything that we do. But I yeah, the whole relatability thing is it's bittersweet. If you make a good one, that means that I get paid a little bit more with people purchasing the print. Um, but it can often feel like it often feels a little bit like I'm selling out in a way. Um, so I do try to keep a balance to keep myself feeling good about the artwork that I make. I never want to feel like I'm making comics for, the algorithm.
Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick second to talk about Macroverse. Macroverse is a next-gen mobile comics app, with its tap story format making comics feel totally native on mobile devices, which you can experience over 45 series and 400 episodes, with more launching all the time. It's a perfect time to try it out, too. Many of the most popular titles like Hex 11, Dead Town, Glitch, and more are free for a limited time only, so download the app for iOS or Android and binge away. Oh, and keep an eye out on macroverse.com for some major updates on new creators, new series, and new features that bring real collectability to digital comics in a new way. Massive things are coming. If you love making, reading, and or collecting comics, you won't want to miss what Macroverse is launching this summer. And now, back to the show. Yeah. I mean, I make this comparison. The fact that I've made it more than once on this podcast is honestly astonishing. But strangely enough, I reference George Clooney's career a bizarre amount of time in this podcast. But it actually makes sense for a cartoonist, especially given what you're saying. One of the things I always really appreciate about George Clooney is George Clooney would be like, I will do one romantic comedy and then I'm going to make Syriana. And I'm going to do one romantic comedy and then I'm going to make Michael Clayton. I'm going to do one action movie, and then I'm going to do, I don't know, The Air Up There, or whatever the hell that movie was called. But anyways,
Yeah.
like, you know, he will do one for the studios if that buys him the one piece of art he can make for himself that means something to him. And I think, I mean, that's what you're talking about is just like, you're going to do stuff that will help you as a person who's trying to make a living off of your art, but not at the expense of never doing something for yourself. You will always be present in the creative denominations of your life, if that makes sense.
That's the hope. Yeah. I don't ever want to feel like I've drawn myself into a corner. I always want to have a creative outlet that I feel like is really rewarding and satisfying for me. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, you know, one thing I was curious about is I think one of the things that people don't really realize about creating things online is like how much work all of the actual, like, you know, I have a website and I have a podcast. In the actual act of creating the podcast probably takes, you know, I mean, like the conversation we're having, let's say it's an hour. So we have an hour long conversation, but actually like editing and preparing for and like putting it up on my website, that's going to take probably 4 times as long, just because I'm very fastidious about making sure that my podcasts sound good and everything like that. And when you're dealing with your website and Twitter and Instagram and Patreon and Facebook and Tapas and Webtoon and Tumblr, and I think I'm missing one. I think that I read that there's 9 platforms, so I'm missing one.
Go Comics, Webtoon.
Oh, I got Webtoon. Go Comics is the one I was missing, but
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, it's like that's another thing that probably takes something away from you as a cartoonist, not to a real degree, but I mean, not to a significant degree because it's part of the process. But I imagine sometimes it feels like posting and managing the strip takes about as much time as actually making them.
Oh yeah. I'm fortunate enough that my partner is helping me out with the business now, but um, when things are going well at False Knees Corp, I I sometimes don't have time to make a comic in a week. There's a lot of stuff in the background. There's a lot of like kind of sitting around and staring at a wall too.
That's the creative process.
Yeah, actually. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the background, and managing all these platforms is a thing on its own. I think I should probably cut out a few. But yeah, it's certainly work that you might not necessarily think takes any time at all. But
It takes a lot.
Yeah.
So let's say you have a new platform you want to go up on, like, you know, Webtoon. Let's use Webtoon as an example. So you go up on Webtoon. How do you decide what to put up?
Yeah, and they all have their own rules, right? Like I think on Webtoon they discourage you from reposting, right?
Mm-hmm.
They only want everything there once. So that's different from the main 3. But for Webtoon, yeah, if I were to join a new website tomorrow that was exactly like Webtoon, where it has this like established comic reading audience, I would probably just start with one of my older animal-based strips. Like I wouldn't go right to the beginning because it doesn't really feel like what I do anymore.
Right.
And I would probably just post the ones that have, you know, birds or animals in them.
Mm-hmm.
And I would start from there. I'd do it probably like semi-chronologically, maybe throw in a new one every once in a while. But yeah, that's something to consider, and it can make or break how well you do on different platforms.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the interesting things that I mean, you go on a new platform, people might think that you're going to be delivering to a certain degree to the same people, but a lot of times they're completely discrete audiences. Like you're finding a completely new audience. Like I bet there's people who read you on Instagram that don't even know you're on other platforms.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'm sure of it.
And it's really interesting because, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why you got to repost, right? Is somebody like I think the first comic I ever saw from you was actually, this is how new I am to False Knees. So I apologize about revealing myself as a newcomer, but the one about the relaxing cardinal, I mean, like that one, that was the first one I saw, but it was on the repost, and I saw it, and it was weird because it just randomly popped up on Twitter, and then it popped up in my search feed for Instagram, and then I realized that several of my friends were following you on there, and I was like, I'm gonna check this out. Next thing you know, I lost an hour, and it's just really interesting because without that repost, I would not have found you, and it is interesting because you repost that and it's new to some people, or it's old to some people, but it's also completely new to others.
Yeah, I'm glad you told me that actually, because I've always had a hard time with reposting. I feel like I should only post new things because my loyal followership only is interested in my new comics. But yeah, new people are joining all the time, and it's super beneficial as a comic writer to have this back catalog of things to show. And people don't really get mad just to have to see a comic that I made 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it's another opportunity for, encouraging people to go to my store. So it's beneficial, but it took me a long time to get around the idea that it was, I don't know, in some ways wrong.
Yeah. My wife makes fun of me because I do all this stuff and it's successful, but this is not saying that I won't promote this, but there's sometimes where I actually feel guilty about even like promoting my stuff because there's something in my head that's like, no, I mean, like this is like there's something wrong. It's like you should just write and be happy about that, and if somebody discovers it organically, they can do that. But it's like I'm trying to keep my own stuff a secret, and I don't know. I mean, I think that kind of comes from the same place to a certain degree, where it's just, it feels wrong to repost it because any number of reasons. But the thing is if something was popular once and it found an audience, and because of the way algorithms work and stuff like that, it's entirely possible that it's going to find a completely different audience because that's just the way it works. And it's so weird. Yeah.
There's probably good and bad ways of doing it.
Oh yeah, you can overdo it.
Yeah, you can overdo it. It's finding that balance that's really important, and I think it's essential now. I think you have to repost. You have to be your own marketing team.
Yeah,
that can feel terrible. It can feel like it can feel like you're selling out somehow. I don't know why that idea bothers me so much and why it crops up in my mind so often.
Did you have a similar problem when you first started selling prints? Like it felt wrong?
Yeah, I think I'm over it now. It's been about 4 years, or maybe a bit longer than that. But it's my main source of income, and I'm quite comfortable with it now. I think that it's a worthwhile endeavor. I think if somebody wants to own a printed copy of my work, then I think that I should make money off of that. I think that that's fair.
I mean, God only knows on the internet, somebody else is going to be making money off of it if you don't.
Oh man, that's another thing you have to look out for as a sole proprietor of an art business, is all these, what are they called? Aggregate, like Society 6.
Right. Where all of a sudden you see somebody with a coffee mug that has your art on it, and you're like, I didn't make that.
Or shower curtains or something.
That'd be very weird if you went into a friend's place and they had shower curtains of your comic and they didn't realize it was your comic. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, by the way, I'm not saying that you should feel guilty at all about the prints. It makes a lot of sense. Your strip works kind of perfectly for that because it's, like we were talking about, whether it's relatable or it's just somebody who has, a particularly odd sense of humor that just jives with yours or something like that. You can't control what speaks to somebody. And if somebody wants that to adorn their wall, like, I mean, behind me, let's see, what do I got? I got James Jean. I have Kazuo Kibuishi's cover to Flight Volume 4, and then I have another piece from an artist that was in one of the Flight editions. And it's just like, I don't think Kazuo Kibuishi made that cover thinking, man, people are going to have this up on their walls. And
Right.
here we are, 15 years later, and I do. And it's just because it's like, I look at that and it just speaks to me. First off, I think it's awesome that you do that. I also think I guess, like, I never would have expected that prints for a webcomic would be such a singularly great part of interest to become like your top source of income. But it really makes sense when I look through the strip, like I said, because there's a lot for people to connect with, and there's always something different for other people to connect with.
Yeah, I think I kind of stumbled into it by chance. I don't know who else was making their own prints at the time when I started, but oh man, I'm so happy that I did find it, because it's something that people want.
Yeah.
There's so many people in the world that want to have artwork on their walls of the people that they, the artwork that they like. I'm always trying to encourage other comic artists, particularly, to start selling prints. I think a lot of people think the same thing that you did, or that I did before I started my store, that like, it doesn't make any sense. Why would somebody put a comic strip on their wall? But I'm here to tell you that a lot of people do. And yeah, if you're an artist out there, make a print shop and run it yourself if you can, because the margins are so much better than having one of these aggregate sites do it for you.
Yeah. I have 2 Charles Christopher strips in my office elsewhere. And so I totally get that. I mean, it's
Carl Kerschel's work is beautiful. His line work is phenomenal.
yeah.
And, it's definitely an inspiration to me.
Well, and I can kind of see, because you use gouache, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I'm not saying it's the same, but I mean, it's like, I think that's one of the things that really separates your work from other strips, is the craft is there on top of the jokes. It's like you can appreciate it on multiple levels. I think that's one of the things I really appreciated about it. It's like I said, I reached out to my friend who's a natural sciences artist, and she was like, yeah, this is awesome. And the combination of that with the fact that you have all these like existential jokes and stuff like that, there's like a really interesting kind of I don't want to say push pull to it, but it's like 2 different flavors that taste great together.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, no, I love to try to strike that balance, and it's exciting because I don't know, there aren't that many examples of people that make even traditional webcomics these days, and I think it's a shame, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for jokes, or for certain kind of storytelling, or just appreciating the artwork that
Mm-hmm.
that you can do in webcomics. Like, it's endless. It's such a phenomenal art form. And I think, like, who knows what's out there? Who knows what webcomics are capable of portraying? It's such an open field still.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's kind of what you're looking to do, is like, how can you push yourself to do different things with the comics you're doing? And I think everyone's kind of doing that to a certain degree. I mean, I've talked to people who made web comics in like the original, like when it was really blown up in like the early 2000s, and it was kind of moving in a certain direction and stuff like that. And it was interesting because, I mean, there's just been such a shift. It went from like, you would have a website where you would host this stuff, and then people would read it, and they would come and they would read like every day, to it's so based around social media and like going to where people are, as opposed to them coming to you. And so I think that you can adjust within the parameters of the way that things work to still push yourself. But I don't know, it is kind of interesting, because there's always going to be that tension with like the platforms you have to utilize.
Yeah, and they can always change, and sometimes overnight, and there's nothing that you can do about it. We're just a participant.
Yeah.
And
where's the false knees TikTok?
oh God. People ask me that, makes me think.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I don't think I'm ever going to get into animation. It does work with a certain style of webcomic, but mine, I think it would just look too uncanny.
Yeah, for sure. I think that one thing, like the one thing that always really struck me about, like, I love Stuart Immonen, Stuart and Catherine Immonen. I don't know if you know them, but they actually, I feel like there would be a real overlap between you because they do. Stuart does a bunch of art for Marvel and DC and variant publishers, but they also do comics together through like Ad House and variant other publishers. And they did a web comic on Instagram called Grass of Parnassus. And the thing that and also the other thing that overlaps with you is they're huge birders. Stuart loves taking photos of birds, and he actually did a Marvel variant where, like, I think he put something like 100 different like species of birds on there.
Oh
Um,
wow.
but it is interesting because I was like, I love the fact that they were putting that comic up on Instagram, but there was a part of me there was a terrible part of me that was like, how are they going to make money off of this? And eventually they got a book deal out of it, so it worked out. But I mean, the thing that I think really works for something like you and where you're doing the prints and everything like that, you have this on like 9 different platforms, which means that you have these 9 different audiences and you have all these hundreds of thousands of people liking and sharing and everything like that. It's getting you an audience you wouldn't be able to get if you charged money for the comic itself. But then you can turn that audience into people who buy the prints or buy your book or whatever. And I don't know. I mean, that kind of actually experiencing False Knees kind of helped me understand how Instagram comics could be monetized because I mean, in theory, the platform should be amazing for cartoonists.
Yeah. It is. I think that it just takes a little bit of thinking about how you can monetize it, and it might not necessarily be prints, but I've always thought that webcomics they're an interesting thing on its own because it's never behind a paywall. Or I mean, maybe there are sites that do it now. I mean, Patreon
Yeah,
or whatever.
Patreon, yeah.
Um, but what you see is it can be a product. It's also advertising because it gets more people into your like profile or whatever.
Right.
So you can sell. It's kind of like an ad. It's kind of like artwork on its own that you can also sell. I don't know. It bridges a lot of things, and I don't think that there's enough people taking advantage of it right now.
No, I mean, it's like you're saying, it's like the comic simultaneously is an ad. The comic is simultaneously an ad for the product you're selling, which is the comic. There's like
Yeah,
I don't know,
yeah.
a reciprocal relationship between them. Yeah, that is really interesting, but I could go on about this stuff forever. I'm going to close with something I have to bring up. I am a massive, I think part of the reason why I love False Knees so much is I love birds. I'm a huge bird fan. I don't mean that in a Portlandia way. I mean, like, I live in Anchorage, Alaska, and we have a large community of like Stellar's jays, like magpies, seagulls, bald eagles, chickadees, all kinds of stuff that come out here. Unfortunately, I also have cats, and they're like an ongoing war between them. We also have squirrels, which show up in your comics too, which I appreciate. But I have to ask, I don't know. I mean, you've went through all of these different books about birds, and you've taken your own photos. I'm sure you have bird opinions. What is the number one bird in your personal bird power rankings?
Oof. Do you mean like?
Which one do you? Is there one that is in your heart of hearts that you love the most above all?
Uh,
I,
oh,
I can tell you mine to buy you a second.
okay, yeah. Let's buy me some time.
Peregrine falcon.
Yeah.
I've loved Peregrine Falcon since I was a kid. I'm like a stats nerd too, and we had this encyclopedia of birds that had pictures and all this stuff. And as soon as I read that it was like the fastest animal in the world, and when it like dives at like 240 miles per hour, I was like, this bird is so amazing. And I don't know. We have a Peregrine Falcon at our zoo. I've like seen them in the wild. I actually, fittingly, Carl Kerschel did a Kickstarter recently for Charles Christopher, and one of his bonus things you can do as an add-on was he did animal paintings, and he did one of a Peregrine Falcon, and I got it. And
Did you really?
yeah,
Oh,
I
wow.
did. I was like, oh my god, I gotta get this, and I managed to beat everyone to the Peregrine Falcon prize. But yeah, I have a lot of love for the Peregrine Falcon.
Peregrine falcon is an amazing bird, and it's one that when you see it, like live
Yeah,
with your own eyes. It feels magic. Like it
it
feels like
does.
it's this special being. Yeah, that's a good pick. I've thought about this question so much, and my answer changes all the time. I love so many. I think I think it's pretty obvious from the number of strips that I've done that I really like crows.
Yeah, super smart.
Maybe it's a bit of a boring answer because they're such a common bird, but they're still so interesting to me. And this spring we had a family of crows start nesting just a couple houses over from us. And they would come over to our tree and check us out. And we eventually started leaving unshelled peanuts around for them.
We do that for our Stellar Jays.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they really got used to us, and it got to the point where we were giving them peanuts every day, and we had like a couple different spots that we would put them out, and we would, see them trotting over to us or hopping around on branches and stuff. And there's so much fun to watch. They left, unfortunately. I don't know. They're on to greener pastures. But crows definitely up there. I love chickadees too. They're always around, year round,
Mm-hmm.
where I'm from. And I love that. I love that they're just our constant companions.
Yeah, no, and I don't know why, but like in my head, they're like a sweet bird. They have like this like sweetness to them, and I can't even explain it. I think corvids in general, it's like I think kind of that species or that family with like crows and ravens and magpies and et cetera, et cetera. Like I think they don't get enough credit, and I think it's because I think it's kind of like with cats. I think to a certain degree, people mistake their intelligence for being an asshole.
Yeah. I have a lot of love for no, not people at all, for birds that people consider to be pests.
Mm.
Like I love ring-billed gulls, the ones that are always plaguing beaches and everything.
Well, after those fries, right?
Yeah, but to watch them fly in the air, they're so graceful.
Mm-hmm.
I love house sparrows. I love starlings. All the ones that people, will try to discourage from coming to their feeders for whatever reason. I mean, they're all animals. They all have their own social communities, and starlings in particular have an amazing ability to imitate. I didn't know until last year that these sounds that I was hearing from my window, it wasn't a red-tailed hawk. It wasn't a robin. It wasn't, what other birds does it imitate? Crows sometimes, seagulls. Like, these little tiny starlings can imitate all these other birds so well. It's so fascinating.
Yeah. I don't know. I love it. I could talk about birds for forever, but Joshua, I will leave you at that. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on birds, on false knees, your art, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, you got to cut me off when we start talking about birds.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Joshua Barkman. You can find his webcomic False Knees on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Webtoon, Tapas, Go Comics, Patreon, and on its website. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content, and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking on Facebook at /sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic, or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Raj Patel, Submed Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buon, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Zach Thompson, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Megan Marsden, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambi, Bombay, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzzbubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Slates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Liana Kangas, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwant, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Union, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Nassie, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Odd Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.